The bright yellow SUV slammed into my wooden gate without even hitting the brakes. Pieces of my fence exploded like shrapnel, and the barn I'd just built last week tilted at a crazy angle. I hadn't even processed what happened when the driver stepped out, a woman wearing a wrinkled blouse, messy hair, crooked eyeliner, clutching a clipboard like she was inspecting a prison camp. "I'm the president of the HOA," she screamed. "This property violates landscaping code." I stood there frozen, not from shock, but because I couldn't tell if this was real life or some prank for social media. Have you ever had an HOA literally crash into your life like this? If not, stick around until the end, because this story goes way further than you think. Comment below where you're watching from if you've ever dealt with a self-appointed neighborhood authority figure. It was 7:15 on a Saturday morning when the yellow SUV first appeared in my driveway. I was sitting at my kitchen table in my gray hoodie and black joggers, sipping coffee and working on some code when the aggressive honking started. Through my Ring doorbell camera, I could see a woman in her late 20s with frizzy hair sticking out in all directions, wearing what looked like gym clothes that had seen better days. She was gesturing wildly at my front door, and her voice was already reaching that pitch that makes dogs howl 3 blocks away. The bright yellow SUV behind her was parked at such an angle that it blocked half my driveway. Clearly, subtlety wasn't her strong suit. "Cole Peterson," she screamed, pounding on my door with enough force to wake the entire neighborhood. "I know you're home. Open this door right now." I glanced at my security camera feed and felt my first cup of coffee suddenly taste bitter. This had to be Lindsay Geller, the woman my neighbor Harrison had warned me about during our brief chat last week. He'd mentioned something about a self-appointed HOA president who liked to cause trouble, but I figured it was just typical neighborhood gossip. Looking at this woman's aggressive stance and the way she kept jabbing her finger at my camera, I realized Harrison might have understated the situation. Her entire demeanor screamed entitlement mixed with barely contained rage, and something told me that opening my door would be like feeding a hungry bear. It would only make things worse. I pressed the intercom button on my doorbell system and tried to keep my voice calm and professional. "Good morning," I said, watching her reaction through the camera feed. "I'm sorry, but I'm busy right now. Do you have an appointment or some kind of emergency?" The question seemed to trigger something in Lindsay, because her face turned red and she stepped even closer to my door. "I don't need an appointment," she shrieked, her voice going up at least 2 octaves. "I'm Lindsay Geller, the HOA president of this community. I have the legal right to inspect your property for violations, and you're going to let me in right now?" The way she said legal right made it sound like she was reading from some official script, but something about her delivery felt rehearsed and hollow. I could feel my patience starting to wear thin, but I'd learned from previous customer service experiences that staying calm often revealed more about the other person's true intentions. "I appreciate you introducing yourself, Lindsay," I replied through the intercom, making sure to keep my tone neutral. "However, I'm not aware of any scheduled inspections, and I haven't received any official notice about property violations. Could you please explain what specific issue you're here to address?" Through the camera, I watched her face cycle through several emotions: surprise, anger, and then something that looked like calculation. She clearly hadn't expected me to ask for details, and the way she hesitated told me she might not have any legitimate reason for being here. "Your rose bush," she finally blurted out, pointing dramatically toward the small garden bed near my front fence. "You planted that rose bush without HOA approval, and it's a clear violation of our community landscaping standards." I almost laughed out loud at that. The rose bush in question was barely 3 feet tall and had been there when I bought the house 6 months ago. If anything, it was one of the most well-maintained plants on the block, and I'd actually received compliments from other neighbors about how nice it looked. But Lindsay was clearly grasping at straws, and her increasingly frantic gestures suggested she knew her excuse was weak. "That rose bush has been there since before I moved in," I explained patiently, "and I haven't received any documentation about landscaping restrictions or HOA bylaws." This seemed to push Lindsay over some invisible edge, because she started pacing back and forth in front of my door like a caged animal. "Documentation?" she screeched. "I don't need to provide you with documentation. I'm the documentation. I'm the president of this HOA, and when I tell you there's a violation, that means there's a violation." Her logic was so circular it made my head spin, but what struck me most was the desperation in her voice. This wasn't just about a rose bush. There was something else driving her behavior, something that made her feel like she needed to assert dominance over every interaction. I reached for my phone and quietly started recording the conversation, sensing that I might need evidence of this encounter later. "I understand you believe you have authority here," I said carefully, "but I'm going to need to see some official documentation before I can take any action. Property rights are pretty well established, and homeowners generally can't be compelled to allow inspections without proper notice and legal justification. The moment I mentioned property rights and legal justification, Lindsay's demeanor shifted dramatically. Her face went from red to almost purple, and she stepped so close to my door that her breath was fogging up the camera lens. Legal justification, she repeated, her voice dripping with venom. How about this for legal justification? If you don't open this door right now and let me inspect your property, I'm going to fine you $500 per day until you comply. $500 per day. The number was so absurd that I almost burst out laughing, but Lindsay's serious expression told me she genuinely believed she had that kind of power. I made a mental note to look up HOA regulations in our area because something about this entire situation felt fundamentally wrong. That's quite a substantial fine, I replied, still keeping my voice level. I'll definitely need to see the specific bylaws that authorize those penalties, along with documentation of your authority to impose them. Through the camera, I could see Lindsay's hands shaking with rage, and for a moment, I wondered if she might actually try to break down my door. Instead, she spun around and marched back toward her yellow SUV, muttering something under her breath that the camera couldn't pick up. "This isn't over, Cole Peterson," she shouted over her shoulder as she reached her vehicle. "You have no idea who you're messing with. I'm going to make your life a living hell until you learn to respect authority." The threat was delivered with such theatrical drama that it might have been funny if not for the genuine malice in her voice. As she climbed into her SUV, I noticed she took several photos of my house from different angles, including close-ups of my front yard and the infamous rosebush. The yellow SUV's engine roared to life with unnecessary aggression, and Lindsay peeled out of my driveway with enough force to leave tire marks on the concrete. As I watched her disappear around the corner, one thought kept running through my mind. This woman was planning something, and whatever it wasn't going to be pleasant. 2 days later, I found a certified letter waiting in my mailbox with an official-looking letterhead that read, Meadowbrook HOA Authority. The envelope was thick and formal, the kind of thing that immediately makes your stomach drop even when you know you haven't done anything wrong. Inside was a violation notice claiming I had committed multiple infractions related to unauthorized landscaping modifications and failure to comply with community standards. The fine listed was $750, apparently calculated at Lindsay's arbitrary daily rate plus some kind of processing fee. What struck me immediately was how professional the document looked on the surface, complete with official-sounding language and references to specific subsections of community bylaws. But as I read more carefully, the cracks in Lindsay's facade became obvious. The letterhead included a P.O. box address that, when I looked it up online, turned out to be a commercial mail service anyone could rent for $20 a month. The authorized signatures at the bottom of the document looked suspiciously similar, as if the same person had tried to write their name differently multiple times. Most telling of all, the specific violations they cited were completely fabricated. My rosebush was apparently blocking a community sight line. That didn't exist, and I was accused of modifying shared landscaping elements, even though the plant was entirely on my own property. I spent the next hour researching HOA regulations in our area, and what I discovered was enlightening. According to the county records, our neighborhood had never actually established a legally recognized homeowners association. There were no filed incorporation documents, no registered bylaws, and no official board of directors. The previous owners of various houses had apparently discussed forming an HOA years ago, but nothing had ever been formalized through proper legal channels. This meant that Lindsay's entire authority structure was essentially a fantasy. She was operating as president of an organization that didn't legally exist. Armed with this information, I decided to do some neighborhood reconnaissance. I called Mrs. Becker, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down and had always been friendly during our brief encounters. "Oh, Lindsay," she said with a sigh when I mentioned the violation notice. "That poor girl has been trying to run everyone's lives for months now. She convinced my neighbor Greg to help her distribute warning notices about everything from mailbox colors to garbage can placement. Most of us just ignore her, but she's been quite persistent with some of the newer residents." Mrs. Becker went on to explain that Lindsay had created some kind of online community group where she posted her own interpretations of neighborhood standards, but only about a dozen people had joined, and most of them rarely participated. The more I learned about Lindsay's operation, the more fascinated I became with the sheer audacity of it all. She had essentially created an entire bureaucratic structure out of thin air, complete with official-looking documents and penalty systems, then tried to enforce it through pure intimidation. It was like discovering that someone had been operating a fake police department in their garage, impressively elaborate, but completely illegal. I decided to call her bluff with a carefully worded email that requested documentation of her authority and the legal basis for her fines. I kept the tone professional and respectful, but included just enough legal terminology to make it clear that I wasn't going to be intimidated. Lindsay's response came within 30 minutes, and it was exactly what I expected. A rambling, incoherent mess that avoided every specific question I had asked. She claimed that my request for documentation was frivolous and obstructive, and threatened to escalate the matter to higher authorities. The email was filled with capitalized words and multiple exclamation points, giving it the appearance of someone who was rapidly losing control of their carefully constructed facade. What worried me most was her closing line. "You have 24 hours to comply with the original inspection demand, or you will face the full consequences of your defiance." 24 hours later, at exactly 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, the yellow SUV returned. This time, Lindsay didn't bother with the pretense of polite conversation. She pulled into my driveway, parked at an aggressive angle, and immediately started honking her horn in a pattern that could only be described as hostile. Through my security camera, I could see her gesturing angrily at my front door while shouting something I couldn't quite make out over the noise. When I didn't immediately respond, she got out of her SUV and began pounding on my door with both fists, screaming about my continued defiance and deliberate obstruction of lawful authority. I decided to let her tire herself out while I continued working at my computer, but Lindsay apparently had a different plan in mind. After about 10 minutes of increasingly frantic door pounding, she stormed back to her SUV and climbed inside. I watched through my camera as she sat there for a moment, apparently having some kind of internal debate, before putting the vehicle in reverse and backing up several yards. Something about her posture and the way she was gripping the steering wheel made me suddenly nervous. I stood up from my desk and moved closer to the window just as Lindsay floored the accelerator and drove her yellow SUV straight into my wooden front gate. The sound was incredible, a tremendous crack followed by the splintering of wood and the screech of metal against timber. My beautiful cedar gate, which I had spent 2 weekends refinishing just last month, exploded into pieces as the SUV plowed through it. Wooden debris scattered across my front yard, and Lindsay's vehicle came to rest halfway through the destroyed gateway. Its front bumper crumpled and steam rising from the radiator. The entire incident was captured in perfect detail by 3 different security cameras, including my Ring doorbell and 2 outdoor cameras I had installed after moving in. As I stood there staring at the destruction, I realized that Lindsay had just handed me the perfect evidence of her completely unhinged behavior. Lindsay climbed out of her damaged SUV, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she had just committed what was probably several felonies. "Look what you made me do," she screamed, pointing at the wreckage of my gate, as if I had somehow forced her to drive through it. "This is what happens when people don't cooperate with legitimate authority. You could have avoided all of this if you had just let me inspect your property like a reasonable person." Her logic was so twisted that I almost felt sorry for her, but any sympathy evaporated when she started taking photos of the damage as if she were documenting evidence of my wrongdoing rather than her own criminal behavior. The yellow SUV was clearly not going anywhere under its own power, and I could already hear sirens in the distance. Apparently, one of my neighbors had called the police. The text message came from an unknown number about an hour after Lindsay had limped away in a tow truck, leaving her destroyed gate and a yard full of wooden debris behind. "I saw everything," the message read. "We need to talk. A neighbor." I was still dealing with insurance representatives and trying to clean up the mess when my doorbell rang again. This time, thankfully, it wasn't Lindsay. Instead, I found myself face to face with Harrison Doyle, the 73-year-old retired lawyer who lived 3 houses down. Harrison was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the destruction in my front yard. "I've been watching this situation develop," Harrison said without preamble, gesturing toward the pile of splintered wood that used to be my gate. "That woman has been terrorizing this neighborhood for months, and it's time someone did something about it." He handed me a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. "I've been documenting Lindsay's activities because I suspected this day would come. She's not just harassing you, she's been running a systematic scam operation that's affected at least 6 families in this area." The folder contained copies of fake violation notices, forged signatures on supposed HOA documents, and even bank deposit slips showing that Lindsay had been collecting money from neighbors for community improvements that never materialized. As Harrison and I were examining the evidence, another vehicle pulled up. A brown UPS truck driven by a young Hispanic man who looked both nervous and determined. "Excuse me," he called out as he approached us. "Are you Cole Peterson?" I'm Mike Torres, and I deliver packages in this neighborhood. I heard about what happened with the crazy HOA lady, and I think I can help." Mike explained that Lindsay had been harassing him for months, demanding that he follow specific delivery schedules and routes that she claimed were community regulations. She had even filed complaints with UPS corporate about his non-compliance, nearly costing him his job. "I've got video footage of her blocking my truck and screaming at me," Mike said, pulling out his phone. "My supervisor told me to document everything because she's been calling our customer service line almost daily." The three of us were still talking when another neighbor approached. Greg Simmons, a middle-aged man I recognized from Lindsay's small circle of supporters. Greg looked uncomfortable and kept glancing around as if he expected Lindsay to appear at any moment. "I need to tell you guys something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lindsay asked me to help her distribute violation notices and warning letters to people in the neighborhood. She told me she was the official HOA president and that we needed to maintain community standards." Greg pulled out a stack of papers from his jacket pocket. "But after seeing what she did to your gate today, I realized she might not be telling the truth about her authority." Greg's revelation was the breakthrough we needed. He had copies of all the fake documents Lindsay had given him, including templates for violation notices and a list of neighbors she wanted to bring into compliance. Most damning of all, he had screenshots of text messages where Lindsay explicitly instructed him to forge signatures on HOA formation documents. "She told me we needed to make it look like more people had agreed to establish the HOA than actually had," Greg admitted, his face red with embarrassment. "I thought it was just paperwork technicalities, but now I realize she was asking me to help her commit fraud." The text messages were incredibly incriminating, showing Lindsay's deliberate plan to create fake authority through forged documents. Harrison studied Greg's evidence with the sharp focus of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud," he said grimly. "Lindsay hasn't just been harassing people. She's been running a criminal enterprise designed to extort money from neighbors through fake legal claims." He pointed to specific bank deposit records that showed Lindsay had collected nearly $3,000 from various neighbors over the past 8 months. She told people these were mandatory HOA fees for lawn maintenance and community improvements, but look at these dates. She was depositing the money into her personal account. As we were piecing together the full scope of Lindsay's operation, Mike's radio crackled with a call from his dispatcher. "I've got to get going," he said, "but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Half the neighborhood is fed up with her behavior, but most people were too intimidated to speak up." He handed me his business card with his personal phone number written on the back. "If you need more evidence or witness statements, just call me. I've got footage from my truck's dash cam going back 6 months, including the time she tried to block me from delivering to your house because she said you were under investigation." Greg was clearly wrestling with guilt about his involvement in Lindsay's scheme, but his willingness to come forward was encouraging. "There's something else you should know," he said, glancing around nervously. "Lindsay has been telling people that she has connections with city officials who can make life difficult for anyone who doesn't cooperate. She claims she could get building permits denied or have code enforcement officers sent to harass people." Harrison shook his head in disgust. "Classic intimidation tactics," he said. "She's been playing on people's fears of bureaucratic retaliation to maintain control over the neighborhood." As Greg walked away, promising to provide any additional evidence we might need, I realized that Lindsay's carefully constructed web of lies was finally starting to unravel. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. As Harrison and I were finishing our conversation, Mrs. Becker appeared with a plate of cookies and a mischievous smile. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion," she said sweetly, "and I thought you might be interested to know that my Ring doorbell has been recording Lindsay's activities for quite some time." She handed me a USB drive with a wink. "That includes the footage of her casing your house last week, taking measurements of your fence line, and practicing her official inspection speech in her driveway." Mrs. Becker's evidence was the final nail in Lindsay's coffin. Video proof that her entire performance had been premeditated and calculated, not the spontaneous actions of someone genuinely concerned about community standards. Deputy Ross Parker arrived at my house the next morning in response to what he later told me was one of the most bizarre police reports he'd encountered in 15 years of law enforcement. Lindsay had apparently called the sheriff's office to report that I was harassing and threatening a community official and had deliberately destroyed HOA property during our confrontation. According to her version of events, she had been conducting a routine inspection when I became violent and somehow caused her vehicle to crash into my own gate as part of an elaborate insurance fraud scheme. The story was so convoluted and illogical that Deputy Parker said he knew something was off before he even arrived at my house. Deputy Parker was a professional, no-nonsense officer in his early 40s who had clearly dealt with neighborhood disputes before. He listened patiently as Lindsay, who had arrived moments after him in a rental car, launched into a lengthy explanation of my supposed crimes against the homeowners association. "Officer, this man has been deliberately obstructing lawful authority," she declared, gesturing dramatically toward my house. "As the duly elected president of the Meadowbrook HOA, I have the legal right to inspect properties for code violations, and he has been preventing me from carrying out my official duties." She was wearing the same gym clothes from our previous encounters, but now they looked even more disheveled, and her hair was sticking up in directions that seemed to defy physics. I had prepared for this moment by gathering all the evidence Harrison, Mike, and Greg had provided, along with my own security footage and documentation. "Deputy Parker," I said calmly, "I'd like to show you some information that might clarify this situation." I handed him a folder containing the county records showing no legal HOA in our area, copies of Lindsay's forged documents, and screenshots of her text messages instructing Greg to falsify signatures. "I believe Mrs. Geller has been operating under some misconceptions about her authority in this neighborhood." Deputy Parker's expression grew increasingly serious as he reviewed the evidence, occasionally glancing up at Lindsay with the kind of look that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am," Deputy Parker said, his voice taking on the formal tone that police officers use when they're about to deliver bad news, "HOA authority doesn't grant you the right to access private property without consent, even if such authority existed. But more importantly, these documents suggest that your claimed authority may not be legitimate." Lindsay's face went through several color changes as she processed what he was saying. "What do you mean, not legitimate?" she sputtered. "I have incorporation papers. I have signed agreements. I have been collecting dues and maintaining community standards for months." Her voice was getting higher with each word, and I could see Deputy Parker's hand moving instinctively toward his radio. At that moment, Greg Simmons appeared at the edge of my driveway, looking nervous but determined. "Deputy Parker," he called out, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to report something about Mrs. Geller and the HOA documents." Greg's timing couldn't have been better, or worse, depending on your perspective. He approached with a manila envelope and a deeply uncomfortable expression. "Officer, I need to confess that Mrs. Geller asked me to help her forge signatures on HOA formation documents. She told me it was just a formality, but I realize now that what we did was illegal." The envelope contained the original templates Lindsay had given him, along with examples of the forged signatures they had created together. Lindsay's reaction to Greg's confession was immediate and explosive. "You traitor!" she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "How dare you betray the community like this? We were trying to maintain standards and property values, and you're sabotaging everything we've worked for." Her outburst was so loud and aggressive that Deputy Parker actually stepped between her and Greg, clearly concerned about the situation escalating further. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down," he said firmly. "These are serious allegations, and your reaction isn't helping your case." But Lindsay was beyond reason at this point, pacing back and forth and muttering about conspiracies and ungrateful neighbors. Just as Deputy Parker was wrapping up his initial investigation, the situation took another dramatic turn. A white pickup truck with magnetic signs reading Municipal Code Enforcement pulled into my driveway, driven by a young man in an ill-fitting khaki uniform that looked like it had been purchased from a costume shop. "Mr. Peterson," he called out, clearly reading from a script, "I'm here to conduct a mandatory inspection of your property following reports of code violations." The timing was suspicious, and when I glanced toward the street, I could see Lindsay's rental car parked at the end of my block. Deputy Parker immediately recognized what was happening and approached the fake inspector with professional authority. "I'm Deputy Parker with the Sheriff's Office," he announced, showing his badge. "May I see your credentials and work order for this inspection?" The fake inspector's face went white, and he started backing toward his truck while mumbling about being at the wrong address. At that moment, the real city inspector arrived, Janet Rodriguez, summoned by Harrison's phone call to report suspicious activity. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the young man with genuine government authority. "I'm Inspector Rodriguez with the City Code Enforcement Office. We have no record of any inspection requests for this address." The fake inspector chose that moment to flee, peeling out of my driveway and disappearing around the corner. Lindsay, who had been watching the scene unfold with increasing panic, tried to distance herself from the obvious fraud. "I don't know who that person was," she stammered, her confident demeanor completely shattered. "He was supposed to... that wasn't..." Inspector Rodriguez was taking notes and asking pointed questions about Lindsay's involvement in the fake inspection scheme, while Deputy Parker documented everything for his report. The evidence was now overwhelming. Lindsay had not only created a fraudulent HOA, but had also attempted to impersonate government officials to intimidate neighbors into compliance. As both officials reviewed the mounting evidence against Lindsay, her desperation became increasingly apparent. She started making wild accusations about community conspiracies and claiming that we were all working together to frame her for crimes she hadn't committed. "These people have been harassing me," she insisted, pointing accusatory fingers at everyone present. "I'm the victim here. I've been trying to maintain community standards and they've been sabotaging my efforts from the beginning." Her complete disconnection from reality was now on full display, witnessed by 2 government officials and recorded by multiple security cameras throughout the neighborhood. Deputy Parker and Inspector Rodriguez spent another hour documenting the evidence and taking statements from everyone involved. Lindsay's story kept changing as she tried to explain away the fake inspector, the forged documents, and the fraudulent collection of HOA fees. By the end of the interview, she had contradicted herself so many times that even she seemed confused about what version of events she was supposed to be defending. As the 2 officials prepared to leave, Deputy Parker pulled me aside one final time. "This is going to end soon," he said quietly. "People who create this level of elaborate deception usually can't maintain it much longer once it starts falling apart." That evening, as I was grilling dinner on my back patio and trying to process the day's events, I heard someone calling my name from the other side of my fence. "Cole? Cole Peterson? I need to talk to you." The voice was male, unfamiliar, and carried a tone of urgency mixed with embarrassment. I walked over to the fence line and found myself looking at a man in his mid-40s wearing work clothes and an expression of profound discomfort. "I'm Henry Geller," he said, extending his hand through a gap in the fence. "Lindsay's husband, and I owe you an apology for what my wife has been doing to you and this neighborhood." Henry looked exhausted in the way that people do when they've been carrying a heavy secret for too long. "I work in construction, so I'm away most days. I didn't realize how bad things had gotten until she came home talking about ramming through your gate." He pulled out his phone and showed me bank statements from their joint account, pointing to regular deposits over the past 8 months. Lindsay has been collecting money from neighbors under false pretenses. She's taken almost $3,000 from people in this community, claiming it was for HOA fees and community improvements. But look at the withdrawal patterns. It all went to her personal shopping and spa treatments. "Henry," I said carefully, "what you're describing isn't just neighborhood drama. It's organized fraud. Your wife has been running a criminal enterprise." Henry nodded miserably, clearly aware of the legal implications. "I know. I've been trying to figure out how to handle this without destroying our family, but after what happened with your gate, I realized I can't protect her from the consequences anymore." He handed me a business card with his work information. "If you need documentation of the financial fraud or witness testimony, I'll provide whatever you need. I'm tired of being complicit in her delusions." Our conversation was interrupted by familiar angry shouting from my driveway. "Henry, I know you're back there talking to him." Lindsay had apparently returned and figured out where Henry had gone. We could hear her stomping around my front yard, probably surveying the gate damage and working herself into another rage. "She barely sleeps anymore because she's constantly worried about neighbors getting away with violations," Henry whispered urgently. The stress of maintaining this fake authority has been eating away at her mental health. As Henry disappeared back through the fence, I heard Lindsay's voice getting louder, suggesting their reunion wouldn't be pleasant. The next morning, I woke up to find 3 messages on my Ring doorbell camera, all recorded between 2 and 4 a.m. Lindsay had apparently spent half the night standing in my driveway, delivering rambling monologues about community standards and my deliberate sabotage of her efforts. The footage was disturbing. She looked disheveled and manic, talking to my camera as if it were a person, and occasionally responding to voices that weren't there. One message was particularly chilling. "You think you can destroy everything I've built here, but you don't understand what you're dealing with. I have connections, Cole Peterson, people who can make your life very difficult." Later that morning, I received a phone call from someone claiming to be a city building inspector who needed to schedule an emergency inspection of my property. When I asked for specific details about what violations had been reported, the caller became evasive and eventually hung up. Something about the voice seemed familiar, and when I mentioned it to Harrison, his response was immediate. "She's escalating toward a complete breakdown. People like Lindsay don't surrender power gracefully. They tend to go nuclear when their authority is challenged." His prediction proved accurate because that afternoon, Lindsay drove slowly past my house 3 times, taking photos and making phone calls that became increasingly animated with each pass. The final straw came that evening when Mrs. Becker called to warn me that Lindsay had been approaching neighbors claiming I was under federal investigation for fraud and that anyone who continued to associate with me could face legal consequences. "She's trying to isolate you," Mrs. Becker explained. "Classic intimidation tactics. But don't worry, most of us see right through her nonsense." However, the fact that Lindsay was now actively trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me suggested that whatever she had planned next was going to be her biggest escalation yet. I spent that night double-checking my security system and preparing for what felt like an inevitable, final confrontation. The final escalation began 3 days later, when Lindsay apparently decided that subtle intimidation wasn't working and it was time to bring out what she considered her biggest weapon. I received a certified letter that morning, this time with an even more official-looking letterhead reading Regional Property Compliance Authority and bearing what appeared to be government seals and signatures. The letter informed me that I was now under investigation by multiple state and federal agencies for violations ranging from tax evasion to conspiracy to defraud local homeowners. The fines had escalated to over $5,000, and I was warned that failure to comply with immediate inspection demands would result in property seizure and criminal prosecution. The letter was so over the top and filled with legal-sounding nonsense that it would have been laughable if not for the fact that Lindsay had already proven herself capable of elaborate fraud and property destruction. What concerned me most was the letterhead itself. Whoever had created it had put significant effort into making it look authentic, complete with official-looking logos and what appeared to be notarized signatures. This wasn't just another rambling threat from an unhinged neighbor. This was a sophisticated attempt to impersonate government authorities on a scale that suggested Lindsay might actually have help from someone with design skills or access to professional printing equipment. I immediately called Harrison to show him the latest escalation, and his reaction was swift and decisive. "This crosses the line from harassment into serious federal crimes," he said grimly. "Impersonating federal agencies is something the FBI takes very seriously, and creating fake government documents is a felony that carries significant prison time." Harrison suggested we contact Detective Williams, the county fraud investigator who had been monitoring Lindsay's activities, to report this latest development. Within an hour, Detective Williams was at my house, examining the fake letter and taking photographs of every detail. "This is exactly what we've been waiting for," Detective Williams explained as he carefully bagged the evidence. Up until now, Lindsay's crimes had been mostly local: fake HOA documents, small-scale financial fraud, property damage. But impersonating federal agencies gives us the justification to bring in federal investigators and really shut down her operation. He went on to explain that they had been building a comprehensive case against Lindsay for weeks, coordinating with the FBI's white-collar crime unit to ensure they had enough evidence to make charges stick. The fake federal letter was the final piece they needed to demonstrate a pattern of escalating criminal behavior. As Detective Williams was finishing his investigation of the letter, my security system alerted me to movement in my backyard. Through the cameras, I could see Lindsay herself climbing over my back fence, apparently having decided that if official intimidation wasn't working, direct confrontation was necessary. She was carrying what looked like a clipboard and a camera, and she appeared to be taking photographs of my house from angles that weren't visible from the street. Detective Williams immediately called for backup and positioned himself where he could observe Lindsay's activities without being seen. Lindsay spent nearly 20 minutes in my backyard, taking pictures of everything from my electrical meter to my garden shed, apparently documenting violations that existed only in her imagination. She also appeared to be measuring things with a tape measure, creating what looked like an official inspection report on her clipboard. The entire performance was being recorded by multiple security cameras, providing perfect evidence of criminal trespassing and continued harassment despite multiple warnings from law enforcement. When she finally climbed back over the fence, she had no idea that her every move had been documented by both electronic surveillance and a detective with 15 years of experience in fraud investigation. The trap was set the next morning when Lindsay returned to my front door with what she clearly believed was overwhelming evidence of my supposed violations. She was accompanied by two people I didn't recognize: a middle-aged woman in a business suit carrying an official-looking briefcase, and a younger man with a camera who appeared to be documenting everything. Lindsay's demeanor was completely different from our previous encounters. She was calm, professional, and spoke with the kind of authority that suggested she genuinely believed she had finally assembled the evidence needed to destroy me. "Mr. Peterson," Lindsay announced through my intercom, "I'm here with representatives from the Regional Property Compliance Authority to conduct the mandatory inspection that you have been illegally obstructing. This is your final opportunity to cooperate before we proceed with property seizure and criminal prosecution." The woman in the business suit stepped forward and held up what appeared to be official credentials, while the man with the camera began recording our interaction. For a moment, I almost wondered if Lindsay had somehow managed to convince real government officials to become involved in her crusade. That illusion was shattered when Detective Williams and 2 FBI agents emerged from their surveillance positions around my property. "Federal agents," one of them announced, showing his badge to the surprised group on my doorstep. "Nobody move. You're all under arrest for impersonating federal officials and conspiracy to commit fraud." The woman in the business suit immediately dropped her briefcase and raised her hands, while the man with the camera began frantically deleting footage from his device. Lindsay's reaction was the most dramatic. She collapsed to her knees and began screaming about conspiracies and frame-ups, apparently unable to comprehend that her elaborate scheme had finally been exposed. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Lindsay's operation. The woman in the business suit turned out to be her sister-in-law, who worked as a real estate agent and had access to official-looking forms and letterhead materials. The man with the camera was Lindsay's personal trainer from the local gym, the same person who had attempted to impersonate a city inspector weeks earlier. Together, they had created an elaborate network of fake authorities and fraudulent documents designed to intimidate neighbors into compliance with Lindsay's imaginary HOA regulations. As Lindsay was led away in handcuffs, still screaming about community standards and property values, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that her month-long campaign of harassment was finally over, but sadness that someone could become so disconnected from reality that they would destroy their own life in pursuit of imaginary power. Detective Williams assured me that the evidence against Lindsay was overwhelming and that she would face federal charges carrying significant prison time. The fake federal letter, combined with her trespassing activities and the involvement of accomplices in impersonating government officials, had elevated her crimes from local harassment to federal conspiracy charges. The final confrontation began at dawn on Friday morning, when I was awakened by my security system's motion alerts. Through my bedroom window, I could see Lindsay's yellow rental car parked across the street, with Lindsay sitting inside talking animatedly on her phone. She had been there for at least an hour, according to my camera timestamps, apparently working up the courage for whatever final scheme she had planned. As I watched, she ended her phone call, took several deep breaths, like someone preparing for battle, and stepped out of her car carrying what looked like a thick manila envelope. What I didn't know was that Mrs. Becker had also been watching Lindsay's surveillance activities and had called Deputy Parker to report suspicious behavior. Harrison had been documenting Lindsay's increasingly erratic pattern of driving by various neighbors' houses at all hours, and the entire neighborhood had essentially been keeping tabs on her activities, creating an informal network of witnesses who were all preparing for whatever final confrontation might be coming. Lindsay's approach was different this time. Instead of her usual aggressive pounding and shouting, she walked calmly to my front door and rang the doorbell like a normal person. When I answered through the intercom, her voice was eerily controlled and professional. "Good morning, Cole," she said, holding up the manila envelope so my camera could see it. "I have final documents that I think you'll find very interesting. These are copies of complaints I've filed with the city, the county, and the state attorney general's office regarding your obstruction of legitimate community governance." The envelope was thick enough to suggest she had prepared some kind of elaborate documentation, though, given her track record with fake paperwork, I wasn't particularly concerned. As Lindsay delivered her prepared speech about the legal consequences I would supposedly face, Deputy Parker's patrol car pulled into my driveway, followed by Inspector Rodriguez and a third car I didn't recognize. The cavalry had arrived, though Lindsay didn't seem to notice their presence behind her. She continued talking about my impending legal troubles, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to face her own reckoning. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," she declared with theatrical conviction. "You're going to prison, Cole Peterson, and your property is going to be seized." Deputy Parker approached quietly and cleared his throat to get Lindsay's attention. When she turned around and saw the 3 officials standing behind her, her confident expression immediately crumbled into panic. Inspector Rodriguez stepped forward with her own manila envelope, which contained the results of the investigation she and Deputy Parker had been conducting. The third official introduced himself as Detective Williams from the County Fraud Investigation Unit, and his presence immediately made the situation feel much more serious. "Mrs. Geller, we have evidence that you've been operating a fraudulent homeowners association, collecting money under false pretenses, impersonating government officials, and filing false police reports. These are all felony charges." The evidence against Lindsay was overwhelming and had been building for weeks through the combined efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies. Henry had provided bank records showing the fraudulent collection of HOA fees. Greg had turned over text messages proving the conspiracy to forge documents, and Mike had supplied video footage of Lindsay's harassment activities. Mrs. Becker's security cameras had captured Lindsay's late-night stalking behavior, and my own footage documented her property destruction and threats. Most damning of all, the fake inspector had been tracked down and had agreed to cooperate with authorities, providing detailed testimony about Lindsay's plan to impersonate government officials. As Detective Williams read Lindsay her rights and explained the charges against her, Henry arrived with his lawyer and divorce papers. The timing was clearly coordinated. Henry had been working with law enforcement to ensure that Lindsay's assets would be frozen.
Lindsay,
Henry said sadly, "I've tried to help you get the treatment you need, but I can't continue to be complicit in your criminal activities. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm going to cooperate fully with the authorities to make sure everyone you've defrauded gets their money back." The look of betrayal and shock on Lindsay's face was almost pitiful, but it was clear that Henry had finally reached his breaking point. The final irony came when Lindsay's yellow rental car was impounded as evidence in the property destruction case related to my gate. As the tow truck loaded her vehicle, Lindsay made one last desperate attempt to maintain her authority while being placed in the back of Deputy Parker's patrol car. "You people don't understand," she yelled through the window. "I was trying to help this neighborhood. You're all going to regret this." Her delusions persisted, even as the evidence of her crimes was being loaded into evidence bags around her. Within a month, Lindsay was facing 12 felony charges, including fraud, impersonation of government officials, extortion, and conspiracy. Henry made good on his promise to return the fraudulent HOA fees to everyone who had been scammed, totaling nearly $3,000. The fake inspector turned out to be Lindsay's personal trainer, who had been paid $500 to impersonate a city official and immediately confessed when confronted by real law enforcement. The neighborhood eventually formed a real homeowners association, with Harrison as president, and my rosebush became something of a neighborhood symbol, protected by actual HOA regulations that recognized homeowners' rights. As I sat on my front porch 6 months later, watering that famous rosebush and enjoying the peace that came with Lindsay's absence, Deputy Parker stopped by during his patrol. "How's the quiet life treating you?" he asked with a smile. I looked around at my repaired wooden gate, my flourishing garden, and my peaceful neighborhood. "You know," I said, "it turns out that sometimes the worst neighbors teach you the most about what real community actually means. And sometimes karma drives a yellow SUV straight into its own destruction." We both laughed as we watched the sun set over a neighborhood that had finally learned the difference between legitimate authority and elaborate delusion.